Okay. Hey class. So I'm recording this video. The other day in class we had some issues with the projectile script, and I realized that it's because I was using an old version of the script. So this is actually a good thing to go over in terms of updating scripts, which we may need to do with certain scripts as we add new features into the game. So I'm going to go over how to do that, and then I'll rebuild the projectile, and then go over the parameters for that script that we can change. So for certain scripts, we're going to be updating them, and when we do that, we need to replace them. And so we can find the scripts under the links menu on the class page, and we can go to the GitHub repo. And you can see different commits. So for example, there's an update to the projectile script. I actually made another quick update just a minute ago to add a couple other comments and things. And then I also updated the player controller script a little bit. So we're going to need to replace both of those in our game to get them to work the way we want to. So if you haven't modified any of the scripts at all, you can basically just like download this whole thing and just replace your whole scripts folder. But if you have modified scripts, you're not going to want to do that. And so since I've modified some of my scripts, what I'm going to want to do is download this this as a folder and then just replace the individual scripts that I want to replace. If you've modified the actual scripts that we're using, some of you may have modified the player controller script. In that case, it's going to be a little bit trickier, and you're going to have to go through and see where the code is different and where it's the same, and add the changes that way. I can also go over with you how to do that in class. So let's go ahead and download this. So I'm just going to scroll up to the top here, and I'm going to download a zip. I'm not going to use the GitHub desktop option for this right now. I just want a copy of the file. So I'm going to download a zip, and that will download a zip to my downloads folder. So I'm going to go over to the Finder, and I'm going to go to my game and find my scripts folder. And then I'm going to open up another Finder window, and I'll just make this one a little bit smaller so I can see them both. And I'm going to go to the downloads folder, and I'm going to unzip this new scripts, and I'm just going to replace two scripts here. So I'm going to replace my projectile script. So I'm just going to drag this over and replace. And then I'm going to replace the player controller script. So again, this is the one that you might have made some modifications to. So if that's the case, you do not want to do this because you will lose those modifications. So if you did do that, let me know. We can go over how to combine them together. Anyway, for me, I'm just going to go ahead and replace this script, and then I can just close this window. And now I'm going to go over to Godot, and it's going to reload these scripts. And so since I already had Godot open, it's asking me if I want to reload, and I do, so I'm just going to reload those. And so now we should be able to create our projectile and have it work the way it's intended to work. So I'm going to do that real quick and then go over the parameters of what we can do with it. So to create the projectile, I'm going to create a new scene, and I'm going to use a area 2D as the main node in the scene. So I'm going to open up, create a new node, type in area, and find that area 2D, and click create. I'm going to rename this to projectile, and then I'll save this. This is going to go into my scenes folder and then my components folder, because this is an individual component. You can really leave the name it whatever you want, but I like to capitalize it, so I'm going to capitalize it there and click save. And so we need a few things in our projectile node to make it work correctly. We can kind of reference the script to see what those are. So I can go ahead and click on this node and go to the script in the inspector and just go ahead and load that projectile script. So it's not going to work right away, but we can get a sense based on the script of what we're going to need. So if we click on that script icon, you can see I've got some different script stuff in here. That's going to be a slightly better version of this, but most of it is the same as what we looked at previously. So we can see that we need this, we need an animated sprite for our projectile art. We need this visible on-screen notifier 2D thing to get rid of the projectile if it goes off the visible screen. And that's all we see in the script, but we also need a collider, of course, because we are using an area. So let's make our animated sprite real quick. I'm gonna hit the plus here and type in animated sprite 2D. And let's go ahead and make those animations. So I have my sprite frames here, and I just have a default animation and then an animation for when the projectile hits something and disappears. So I'm gonna create new sprite frames and click on that to open up the sprite frame editor. I'm gonna rename this default to idle. It doesn't really matter what we call this, but I want this to be auto load, so I have to go make sure to hit that, toggle that on, and then I'm gonna click on my little waffle animated sprite button to go into my sprites folder, choose the projectile image, and I'm gonna zoom in a little bit. This is very small, so I'm gonna zoom in there. It's 2 columns by 3 rows, and I'm just gonna select the first 3 frames, and let's go to 2D mode, and we can hit play to see how that animation looks, and that looks pretty good. So that's our default animation. And so next I'm gonna add a new animation. I'm gonna call this one hit. This is for when the projectile hits something. This one, we don't want it to loop, and I'm gonna speed it up a little bit because it takes a while and it looks sort of goofy when it takes too long to disappear. So I'm gonna speed it up to 10 frames per second. And of course we can adjust that if we need to. So then I'm gonna click on the waffle button again, choose my projectile image again, and now I'm just gonna grab the last 3 frames here, which just is this little animation that makes it disappear, so we can see what that looks like. That looks fine. And remember to toggle loop off. If we don't toggle loop off, it's not really gonna work exactly the way we want it to. And actually, while we're here with our animated sprite, what we need to do is connect the node for when the animation finishes to our script, so that when it hits something, it's gonna play that animation. When that animation is done, we remove the projectile from the scene. So I'm gonna double click here. I'm gonna use the pick button to make sure I pick the right function, which is on animation finish. I'm gonna click OK and click connect. And as usual, when you connect a script, you should see a green arrow pointing to a function that already exists. If you see a new function that didn't exist before that just says pass under it, then you didn't connect it to the right place, so you just need to reset that connection. But we can see here it's connected to this function, and it's gonna remove our projectile after that hit animation is played. Okay, so that's our animation. Let's go back into 2D view, and we'll add a couple more things. So next we need to add a collider. I'm actually gonna go back and set the animation to idle so I can see the shape of the art when I add the collider. So I'm gonna add a new node and use a collision shape 2D. And then I'm gonna, for the shape over here in the inspector, I'm gonna use a circle. And we want this to be smaller than the art. So I'm gonna have to turn off the grid snapping to get it a little bit smaller. And so of course, just like with our other collisions, we don't want it to look like our projectile is disappearing before it actually hits something. So you can really make this pretty small. We want it to be definitely smaller than the art. And really, as long as it exists, it doesn't really matter how small it is. So maybe I'll even make it a little bit smaller like that. And then while I'm doing the collision, let's remember to set our collision layers. So this is going to be on the area 2D. So I'm going to choose the main node again and go to the collision area. And so we're going to choose our projectile layer. If you don't have that, just go to edit layer names and add that in there. It doesn't really matter which layer, we just need to choose one. And then I'm going to turn off the player. So next we choose the mask for things that we want the projectile to hit. So we don't want to hit the player, we do want to hit tiles, we do want to hit enemies and hitboxes, and I think that is it. So we'll just leave those. We can always change those later if we need to. So there's one more component that my projectile needs, which is the visibility on-screen notifier. So I'm going to type that in. This one's long, but I just typed in VISI and it already came up. So this is a visible on-screen notifier 2D. This is just it's sort of like a collider, except instead of colliding with other components in the scene, it is going to detect whether this is visible on the screen. And we actually want this one to be larger than our art. So it's a little bit of the opposite here. The current size is perfect, so we can just leave it as is. But we actually want it to be larger than the art because if the projectile is going off screen, we want the entire projectile to be off screen before we actually remove it to avoid it kind of disappearing all of a sudden. So we've got everything connected. There's one more signal that we have to connect before we finish up, actually a couple. So let's go back to the projectile main node and go to the node menu. And so the projectile can run into two things, enemies and the tile map. And so enemies can be either bodies or areas, and the tile map is a body. So we need to connect both of those events to our script. So I'm going to start with the area entered. I'm going to double click here and then pick on area entered and click OK and click connect. So again, we should see this green arrow appear. And so this is if we're hitting the hit area of a moving obstacle. So this will interact with the moving obstacle as though you had jumped on it with the player, you know, other interactions like that. So then the next node we want to set up is the body entered, and this is going to handle our tile map and the body of the enemy if we want to use that. You don't have to use that. So I'll hit OK here and pick the on body entered and click connect. And so here we go. If we hit the tile map, we're just going to get rid of the projectile. So that should handle all of the ways that this will be set up in our scene. We are going to have to set up a couple things with the player and the enemy, so we'll have to take a look at those. But let's add the projectile into the scene first. So I'm going to go to level 3. I could add it directly to the player, but my player isn't going to have projectiles in every level. So instead, I'm just going to add this in level 3. So I'm going to go to level 3 and choose the player here. You can see that there are several properties related to the projectile that are part of the player controller. So the first one is just a reference to the projectile scene. So unlike our other scenes, we don't actually place projectiles into our levels. We instantiate or create them while the game is already running. And so to do that, we need a reference to the scene itself. So for the projectile, I'm going to click on the empty here, click load, go to scenes and components and choose projectile. And then we have some different options here. We're going to look at what those do in a second. But this should make our projectile work, so we can see that. One last thing we need to check, I think I already set this up, but you do have to map a button to the projectile. So on your input map, you should see the projectile here. Let me just delete that and just go over it again. So if you need to create that, we're going to add a new action. We're just going to call it projectile. It has to be spelled and capitalized exactly as you see it here. We're going to add it, and then we can add buttons, or we can either add mouse press or keyboard buttons. So I'm going to add a Z keyboard button, but I'm also going to add a mouse button. So the left mouse button. So you can shoot the projectile with the mouse or the keyboard. So now that that's set up, let's just look at the default setting. So I'm going to run the scene, and if I hit Z, we see the projectile. One issue that we see is if I'm standing on the ground, the projectile immediately hits the tiles and it disappears. And so we don't want that, but if I'm jumping in the air, you can see I can shoot my projectiles. And the default is that they shoot in a straight line facing whichever way my player is facing. Okay, so let's fix the first issue. So with this design of the player, you can see that the center of the player is actually at the bottom of the player, the way it's set up for Y sorting and stuff like that. And so the projectile is being instantiated, but it's immediately running into the tile and disappearing. So we can use the projectile offset parameter to change that. And you can do this on X or Y, but really for me, I just need to do it on Y. I'm gonna do like -25. And so now I'll be able to instantiate a projectile. And it looks like pretty much like it's coming from where it ought to be coming. The animation is quite fast, so it kind of doesn't look too unrealistic, but you may want to play with that. You can see my projectile hitting my enemy, so that is working out. We'll have to test whether it actually can hit the hit area. That might be a little bit trickier, but let's see if I can. Yeah, it's not, I might need to actually play with that offset if I want to be able to hit the snakes that I'm trying to attack. So let's set it to -20. Let's see if that works a little bit better. Okay, so let's see if I can, okay, so now I can hit them pretty good, and it's making the snakes disappear, so that's exactly the functionality I want. So that's pretty good. It is a little bit hard to aim, but that's sort of built into how it works. So that's our first parameter. So you notice the other two parameters are we can shoot the projectile towards the position of the mouse instead of just in a straight line, and we can also add gravity to the projectile. So let's add gravity first, and we'll take a look at what that looks like. So when I add gravity, the projectile goes in sort of a up and down motion, like an arc. And so this makes it a little bit harder to aim, but it also gives us a different sort of method of using it, which might be useful. And you can adjust that. So some of the adjustments you can make here, but some of the adjustments you'll have to make in the projectile script itself. So if we go to the projectile and go to the script, you can see there's a couple numbers in here that are hard-coded because the projectile doesn't appear in our editor. So one is the speed. That's going to be the horizontal speed. And then down here, I should really make this a variable up here, but you can see this is the arc that's going to be applied is this -600. So you can see that those are the same value. If you want it to have a lower arc, you would lower this number to like 300 or 200. If you want it to have a higher arc, you might lower the speed or raise this number. So those two are going to kind of offset each other to create the arc. Okay, so let's go back, and now let's see if we turn on projectile towards mouse. So here you can see that the projectile is going to go towards the mouse. So I'm clicking with the mouse in different positions, and the projectile is sort of going towards the mouse. There is gravity applied, so it's still got the arc going on, but I would want to have kind of a different control setup than what I've been using typically if I used this setting. So again, you can change the speed, you can do all that in the script. Let's see what that looks like without gravity. So now I can just shoot towards the mouse, but it's just going in a straight line because I'm not applying gravity. So again, this is a little bit of a different setup depending on what the style of your game is and how you want to set up the controls. This might be a better setup for you. And it obviously gives the player a lot more control over the direction of the projectile. Although it looks like, I think I may have just discovered a new bug. Let's see. Yeah, it looks like I've got the directionality of the mouse off. I think I know why that's happening. I'll fix the script and just update it, so by the time you see this, that won't be an issue. So I think I know why it's doing that, and I can fix that in a second. Anyway, those are the basic parameters that we can work with for the projectile. So if you want to change the speed and the setting for the gravity, you need to go into the projectile code and do that in here. Everything else you can set in the player script. You can add a sound if you want to. I'm not going to go over that because we've already covered how to do that, but you could just add a sound into the projectile script, and then you could play it either when it hits the tile map or when it hits an obstacle. You could play it when it first appears, so you could add a ready function for that. But if you want to do different things like that, let me know and we could talk about how to do it. So that's our projectile. There are obviously many different things that we could do to modify this script. So if there's other functionality that you want to try to add, let me know and we can go over that in class.